Hey Sopranos fans, welcome to another episode here on Bully Whispers, and we are here today to discuss Law 22 of Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power, use the surrender tactic, transform weakness into power, in the TV show The Sopranos. The interesting thing about this chapter in terms of The Sopranos is the first historical example given, the dialogue between Athens and the island of Milos during the Peloponnesian War, in which Athens was trying to get Milos to surrender and join them, rather than to stay loyal to Sparta and face what would certainly be a slaughter when Athens invaded. Now, this was a fairly influential dialogue in terms of the course of Western civilization, so even if you're not really a history person, you may already be familiar with some of these concepts and quotes, which can be seen represented throughout the series. So in this episode, we will evaluate Law 22 in The Sopranos by first following the dialogue between Athens and Milos, and showing how some of the topics hit on, such as the nature of justice, the notion of honor, and the consequences of pride, are seen through characters such as Furio, Artie, Ariel, Tony, Leotardo, Little Carmine, and Butch, who is possibly the best example of them all, before moving on to the conflict between Tony and Junior over control, specifically how both attempted it but only one was successful, and then ending with Bobby Baccala, who, much like the last episode where he wasn't playing dumb, isn't faking submission, yet shows how effective it could be if used properly. The island of Milos is strategically situated in the heart of the Mediterranean and was originally colonized by Sparta. According to Greene, during the Peloponnesian War, the Malians refused to align themselves with Athens and chose instead to remain loyal to Mother Sparta. Before launching an all-out assault, Athens sent a delegation to the Malians to try and convince them of the wisdom in yielding. When discussing the subject of justice, the Athenians noted that it was the strong that determined what is just because the standard of justice depends on the equality of the power to compel others, which is why the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they must accept. The most significant of those assertions is that the standard of justice depends on the equality of the power to compel others, and this concept seems very clear when Artie lends money to Jean-Philippe. After Jean-Philippe refused to pay the money back, both Artie and Furio essentially had an equal claim to it. However, the beekeeper had the ability to compel him to pay it back, while Artie did not, which is why people like Furio get justice and $1,000.
$1,000 more?
While people like Artie don't. Now, this particular situation is an example where one side is clearly right from an objective standpoint, but objective standpoints don't really exist in the underworld, so who determines what is just when both sides have valid claims? Well, according to the Athenians, it's the strong who determine what is just, and this is a lesson Ariel is taught the hard way, although it wasn't as painful as it could have been.
Paulie, get the bolt cutters from out of the trunk.
Over the ownership of the hotel. Like the Malians, Ariel has a valid point.
I made this place. The flyer is the car rental drop-off, the business breakfast. It was me, not him. So I sweated blood into this place, and he owes me.
However, also like the Malians, he has no power and finds himself in a bit of a sticky situation. At this point, both Ariel and the Malians begin to speak of honor and the principle of resisting brute force.
2 years, 900 Jews held their own against 15,000 Roman soldiers. They chose death before enslavement. And the Romans, where were they now?
But this proved to be as ineffective for Ariel as it was for the Malians.
You're looking at him, asshole.
To this, the Athenians replied, "Do not be led astray by a false sense of honor. Honor often brings men to ruin when they are faced with an obvious danger that somehow affects their pride. And this is something that we see from Little Carmine during the struggle for control of New York, as well as from both Tony and Leotardo during their conflict with each other, but we'll start with Little Carmine. At Carmine Sr.'s funeral, Little Carmine became enraged when he saw an Opus Dei medallion had been placed on his father by Johnny Sack. Of course, the degree to which he was angry was probably amplified by the fact that Johnny Sack was receiving more respect than he was, but nevertheless, he went from being seemingly quite happy, living a peaceful, semi-legit life in Florida, to wanting to move back to New York to take over the family at warp speed, and he was willing to go to war to do it. Much like the Malians, Little Carmine expected his friends to rush to his side, though this may have been largely due to the sycophants in his presence.
We go all out, we'll steamroll right over John. And I predict the guys in the street in Brooklyn, Queens, they'll welcome us as fucking heroes.
And, much like the Malians, those friends never showed up because it wasn't in their best interest to do so. Now, this is where Little Carmine and the Malians took different paths. Whereas the Malians decided to fight to the end and ended up getting massacred to the point where only a handful survived, little Carmine saw the writing on the wall. According to Greene, aggressive reactions can have an endless rebound effect, leading to enemies continuously overreacting to each other, which little Carmine realized.
How'd it get to this? Retaliation, counterattacks. We're at a fucking Stagmire.
And promptly withdrew from the fight. This, of course, opened the door for a series of events, which culminate with Phil taking control of New York at a time when tensions were high with Tony. When examining the conflict between the two, both were guilty of letting their pride hurt them in the face of superior opposition, although Tony was the initial offender. Now, obviously, like with the Malians, there was a series of events that built friction, but the incidents that caused the whole thing to boil over was Vito's outing. Despite the fact that New York was an overwhelmingly superior force, Tony refused to hand Vito over or take care of it himself, and it's not due to any of the reasons he gave, such as loyalty to his capos or potential future earnings. It was because, like the Malians, he wasn't going to be told what to do. Fortunately for Tony, he realized this was costing everybody money and New Jersey couldn't win a war of attrition, so he was willing to talk peace. On the New York side of things, Phil was upset with the lack of progress and began to lean on his people.
Listen, kid, when this is over, we're going to sit down. Me and you.
Not realizing that he was losing them, which brings us to Butchie. Now, Butch has a conspiracy theory around him that views him as a master puppeteer and is too extensive to get into in this episode without going way off topic. However, assuming that Butch is a puppeteer who had his eye on taking control of New York and possibly a decent chunk of the New Jersey rackets, then he used Law 22 to perfection against both Phil and Tony. Of course, it's important to note here that the surrender tactic isn't necessarily the wave the white flag, unconditional surrender that immediately comes to mind. It's a tactic of submission. With Phil, though Butch remained inwardly firm, outwardly he would bend, appearing to submit to Phil. With Tony, due to the fact that Butch had an overwhelmingly superior force, he couldn't submit to Tony personally without raising suspicions. So instead, he submitted to the same idea as Tony.
We agree. It's gone too far.
Things ended up working out perfectly for Butch, since New Jersey took out Phil, and Tony dropped his guard enough to be hit, should Butch be so inclined, but we don't really know if he was or not. One situation where we know both parties are attempting to use Law 22 is the conflict for control of New Jersey between Tony and Junior. At the start, Tony effectively uses the surrender tactic and lets Junior believe he has won, all the while Tony is working behind the scenes towards his own ends. Of course, Junior finds out and a fight ensues in which Tony comes out on top, and Junior attempts the same move on Tony but without success, although it wasn't because Tony wasn't fooled. In Junior's case, it was due to Richie Aprile's lack of salesmanship combined with Junior's mental decline, but Tony was fooled. Tony believed Junior way more than you should believe anyone that you know tried to have you killed, and the fact that they are related may not be the only factor. According to Greene, people who like to make a show of their authority, like Tony, Phil, and Junior, are especially vulnerable to the surrender tactic, and we see all three of them fall for it during the course of the show. Lastly, this brings us to Bobby Baccala, who, like in the previous episode where he isn't pretending to be dumb, isn't pretending to submit to Tony. This is a genuine and complete tail-between-your-legs submission by Bobby, and within several years, he goes from being the right-hand man for a defeated rival to a top position on the other side. Had he been so inclined, he would have been in prime position to take Tony out, largely due to the combinations of Laws 21 and 22. Well, thanks for watching another episode here on Bully Whispers. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you at the next score.